SUERF, the European Money and Finance Forum, bringing together policymakers, finance, and academia.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this SUERF-Baffi Bocconi e-lecture on the international role of the euro, geopolitical tensions, inflation, and rising yields. What impact on international currencies? Media and several global political scientists and economists have over the past 1.5 years increasingly been discussing whether and how global fragmentation, current geopolitical tensions, notably Russia's war against Ukraine, Western sanctions against Russia, and mounting tensions between the USA, Europe, and China might affect the relative weight of the US dollar, the euro, and other currencies, notably the Chinese renminbi, as international currencies. What factors may lead to shifts in international leading currencies' weights? Earlier today, the ECB released its 2023 annual report on the international role of the euro. The report contains a wealth of data and analysis on various aspects of international monetary system. In addition, it offers very interesting special features and boxes on the aforementioned and on other topics. I really can recommend the read. To find the report on the ECB's website, and we also provided a link on the SUERF website. We are very happy and privileged to have with us today Isabel Vansteenkiste, Director General, International and European Relations at the ECB. Isabel is also a member of SUERF's Council of Management. And Maurizio Habib, Team Lead Economist at the ECB, who will present key findings from the report. This euro area view is then complemented with the US perspective offered by Linda Goldberg, Financial Research Advisor at the Fed New York. To complete our initial round of interventions with an academic perspective, Daniel McDowell, Associate Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies at Syracuse University, will offer us a teaser from his new book, Bucking the Buck, on the workings, impact, and potential longer-term repercussions of US sanctions against Russia on the international role of the US dollar. We will then enter a discussion among the panelists and with all of you. Without further ado, may I hand over to Maurizio.
Many thanks, Ernest. Good afternoon to those in Europe, and if there is anyone connected from outside Europe, good morning and good evening. The presentation is structured like this. I will elaborate on the key developments on the international role of the euro, and pay attention, these are developments in the year 2022, and pass the floor to Isabel to elaborate on a special field. So first main message. You see here a chart of a composite index of the international role of the euro. Then you see the red circle that shows the development that which we focus, there are developments in 2022. There are two lines, and the first line, the yellow line, is this index composite of various market use of the euro international in various market segments, and it shows stability at current exchange rate. The blue line instead is the same index, the same composite index, but measured at constant exchange rate. And that is showing a marked increase in the international role of the euro. So the main difference between the two is the impact of the exchange rate that we elaborate in the next slides. So overall, the main message that we have is that the international role of the euro in 2022 has remained resilient. If we look, in fact, across different market segments, we see that the euro increased in most of market segments. So we are unpacking part of the index, of the composite index that we show in the previous slides. And you can see that, for instance, in foreign exchange settlements, international loans and deposits, debt securities, stock of global foreign exchange reserves, the share of the euro increased. We show also the red bar, which is the exchange rate of the euro. And then you can see that in 2022, the exchange rate of the euro depreciated by 6%. And this explains the difference between the index at constant, all measure at constant exchange rate, and those at current exchange rate. As a result, we see that the euro remained the second most important currency globally, across different market segments. And these are the yellow bars in this chart. So the share of the euro ranges between 20% to 30% and remains the second most important currency. At the same time, you may notice that the dollar remains also the dominant currency on a global scale, with a share ranging between 50% to 90%. And then the 90% is the one on the right-hand side, our foreign exchange turnover, where the shares add up to 200% because there are always two currencies involved in a foreign exchange transaction. So the situation, the snapshot of the international monetary system remains similar to previous years. One market segment that use international use of the euro that attracts particular attention is the one of foreign exchange reserves. And this is the next slide. So here we have two charts. Pay attention. The charts on the left-hand side shows shares at constant exchange rate. The chart on the right-hand side shows changes in 2022 at current exchange rates. And then this chart, this slide has been produced in order to elaborate and to explain how the differences between constant current exchange rates. So at constant exchange rate, on the left-hand side, you see an uptick in the share of the euro. It was 0.5% towards the end. A decline in the share of the dollar at constant exchange rate is by about 2 percentage points, and an increase of other currencies in global foreign exchange reserves. However, this basically reflects the decision of official reserve managers to actively rebalance their portfolios. And this is what is shown on the right-hand side. The right-hand side, you will see that currency they have in the portfolio, they are influenced by valuation effects. And these are mainly exchange rate effects. There are also bond price effects, but these are a little bit smaller. And this is the yellow, these are the yellow bars in the chart, in the bar chart on the right-hand side. And as you can see, as a result of the appreciation of the dollar across the board, the share of the dollar passively at current exchange rate would have appreciated by 2%. If reserve managers, they would haven't done anything. However, managers, official investors, they rebalance. So they sold dollar assets, they bought euro assets, Japanese yen assets, and pound sterling, as you can see from the green bars. So basically, the green bars are those that they reflect the movement on the chart on the left-hand side. Are those that are really monitoring what is going on in terms of active purchasing. So this offsetting is something that is not exceptional. There is a box in the report that shows that this is not something that happened this year. It happens every year. However, this year, as you can see, the share at current exchange rates, they are almost close to zero, so that this offsetting has been basically almost full. While in general, this offsetting is around 30 to 40%. So that is the difference. But this is a traditional behavior of asset managers. Turning to the two important themes that characterized this year, that was characterized by high inflation and the increase in interest rates. Inflation, of course, may have an important impact on the composition of foreign exchange reserves. It may erode the role of international currencies as a store of value. However, there are two caveats. First, this tends to happen over the medium to and long term. Second, if inflation is global and all major reserve currencies are affected in a similar fashion, this may not have an impact on the currency composition of foreign exchange reserves. It may have an impact on, for instance, shifting from reserves to gold, but not on the composition. And this is what the chart on the left-hand side is showing, that basically between the change in the share of foreign exchange reserves and inflation, there is really no relationship, at least in 2022. That doesn't mean that over the longer run, if you have persistent higher inflation in one constituency, that one may have an impact on its international role. Then, of course, together with inflation came higher interest rates and exit from quantitative easing in many advanced economies. So in the euro area, interest rates turned positive in 2022. And this is indeed a positive factor. This is something that has been, we have seen in surveys, has been appreciated by official investors. However, interest rates in the euro area remain lower than in most other advanced economies, as you can see from the chart on the right-hand side. They're higher only than in Japan. So this puts on a relatively disadvantage the role of the euro as an investment currency. Altogether, though, considering that there was an increase in the share of the euro in foreign exchange reserve at constant exchange rate, so that manager actively bought euro, that means that there are other factors that are important, rebalancing, security, and so on. So overall, despite the fact that interest rates in the euro area remain lower than in other constituencies, there was a positive momentum towards the euro. Moreover, and then finishing this part on main developments, if we look at the role of international currency and the impact of interest rates, higher interest rates, then of course, higher interest rates, they foster the international role of currencies as investment currencies. However, they tend to hinder the role as financing, may have an impact, because higher interest rates may lead to lower bond issuance and lower loans, demand for loans in that currency. So actually, the volatility in interest rates, in particular in the first half of 2022, and the higher interest rates, they brought to a large retrenchment in international bond issuance. And then you see this in the chart on the left-hand side. This came across all currencies. As you can see, there is a decline by 700 billion euros, dollars. This is measured in dollars, but across most currencies. In relative terms, you can see this, that the share of the dollar, this is the chart on the right-hand side, the share of the dollar declined, while the share of the euro remained relatively stable. And if you want to know about the dollar, this was mainly led by emerging market issuance. So large issuance of dollar debt is in emerging markets, and there was a disproportionate large retrenchment in bond issue in emerging markets, probably affected by the higher global risk environment that it was caused by the crisis in Ukraine. Then, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was one of the major factors that influenced the report, and this is why I turn it to Isabel and to the special features that we dig into this major event and its impact on the international role of the euro.
Thanks a lot, Maurizio. As such, I will delve a little bit into the 3 special features that are published into this year's edition. So the first one looks at the future of the international monetary system following the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I mean, those who follow each year this report, and were also at the SUERF webinar last year, may remember that we already started to look into this last year. But of course, that was very early stage after the war. And so now, of course, we have a little bit more evidence also on what has happened in the past year and a half. And so we look a little bit into this. Then a second special feature looks into the ongoing discussion that one always has when one talks about the international role of currency, and that's namely trying to understand how one leading international currency replaces another. This special feature looks at one particular interesting episode to get a bit of a better handle on this. And then the third special feature looks at the role of international currencies in global finance, and it focuses basically on the determinants of currency choices in cross-border bank loans. So starting with the first special feature, looking at this geopolitical fragmentation risks and implications for the international role of currencies. This is a little bit of a recollection, maybe also from what was last year in the report already, looking a little bit, saying conceptually, how could such geopolitical fragmentation risks impact the international monetary system following the Russian invasion of Ukraine? And there are really 2 opposing views in a way on this. And the first one says this is more or less like a regime shift. I mean, some observers would say that particularly the sanctions that are imposed on Russia may erode confidence among those countries that are not so geopolitically aligned with the US or the Euro area or the EU, for instance, and basically become more worried about, from their perspective, the safety of, for instance, dollar reserves, euro reserves, and payment rails. And so these countries would, in this argument, try to reduce their dependency on the dollar or the euro, for instance, because of the sanctions, because they see the usability and liquidity of these assets from their perspective being reduced. And they may go then more into alternatives. So, and then, of course, what do we think of is, for instance, non-traditional currencies, but also physical gold, or just maybe reduce their overall level of exposures to FX reserves. Now, the counter-argument to that is basically that, what in the end determines the status of a currency, and in particular as a global safe asset, as a reserve currency, for instance, is really, whether it can offer the safety, predictability, stability, and that fundamentally depends on how sound the institutions of that country are and how sound the macroeconomic fundamentals are. And of course, from that perspective, you could say that the dollar and the euro remain quite unchallenged compared to other currencies. And also when we look, for instance, at another factor that's important, that's this liquidity argument, then, for instance, the deepness and liquidity of the financial markets, in particular in the US debt securities, for instance, but also euro, and the openness to domestic and foreign investors means that there's not really a clear alternative. So, countries may be concerned about the impact of these sanctions and erode their confidence, but there's not so many alternatives out there. So we should not be so fundamentally worried, and we should mainly focus on ensuring that our institutions remain sound and we have good market funding. So that's basically from a conceptual point of view. I mean, we can look now in the last year and a half what we have seen, and maybe we can start by looking a little bit at the anecdotal evidence, and the report has a little bit of a discussion on that. And you may have actually picked up some of these kind of discussions also in the wires and in the news over the past year. There was regularly some coverage of intentions of some countries to use alternative currencies for invoicing of international trade. And here, for instance, in this slide, there's just some examples listed, mainly from emerging markets officials that you can see. And for instance, the most recent one came from President Lula. It's on the bottom of this list, who encourages the BRICS to use more of their own currencies in international trade. So that's basically one piece of evidence that we see. And generally we see also some evidence in that regard, at least anecdotally, that some countries may have the intention to move, for instance, to the Chinese RMB. Now, the question is then, what are we seeing in the data, right? And here, this is the first basically piece of evidence presented in the report. And of course, that's maybe the most obvious country to look at is Russia, and what has Russia itself been doing. And here you can see basically on this chart on the left, the use basically of the RMB in Russian exports. And as you can see, in January 2022, this was basically almost non-existent. So it's the yellow line. You cannot even see it in the utmost left bar chart. But by December 2022, so the end of last year, you see that this share has increased to 15%, so quite a substantial increase. The chart on the right also looks at the use of the RMB by Russia in cross-border payments, and that has also increased sizably and is now almost 2% by the end of 2022. Also, if you look globally, if you look between 2021 and 2022, we find that the share of the RMB in global trade finance doubled by around 4%. So that's basically first one piece of evidence, but maybe not surprisingly, because of course, Russia is basically in the eye of the storm here of this discussion. A second aspect to look at is more the general trends, right? So we can look at case studies, but let's look at the general data. And here, basically this chart shows what are basically the major trends. And if you look at the blue line, where the axis is on the left-hand side, so don't confuse. So on the left-hand side, we see the share of dollar, euro, yen, pound sterling on the blue line combined, basically, in foreign exchange reserves. On the yellow line, which is on the right-hand axis in terms of magnitudes, you see the share of non-SDR currencies combined with the Chinese RMB. And then from 2016 onwards, on the red line, you see here the Chinese RMB basically singled out. So why from 2016? Before that, we didn't really have the data. And in 2016, the RMB entered the SDR basket, and then the currency composition of Chinese reserve holdings became disclosed. So we can look more in detail at that. Now, what we can see in this chart is that there's been already some trend movements which started more or less after the 2007 to 2009 global financial crisis, right? So a diversification away from dollar, euro, yen, pound sterling to these more non-traditional currencies. And if you look over the last 3 years, this trend has more or less intensified. If you look a bit deeper in this trend, what we see is that this really reflects an active portfolio diversification by central bank reserve managers, and most likely driven by two factors. One is a search for higher risk-adjusted returns, but also leveraging on the growing liquidity of non-standard currencies. Now, if you look in 2022, so last year, we see that this portfolio diversification continued, but at a slower pace compared to the preceding years. So if you look, for instance, more concretely at the share of non-SDR currencies and RMB, so the yellow line, there was an increase by about 0.5 percentage points in 2022. So from that basis, we cannot really say that geopolitical factors were the major driver of last year's developments. There was not really an acceleration in the trend, and the trend that we see was actually already started much earlier. So then we can look further at other data points that we have, right? And here on the left-hand side of the chart here, we look at the shares of emerging market currencies in global payments. And you can see for the yellow line is for the fourth quarter of 2022, and we compare here to the final quarter of 2021. And you can see that, yes, the yellow bar is a little bit higher than the blue bars, but overall, we could say these are developments more on the margin. An indicator that we show here on the right is looking at to what extent countries have been reducing their holdings of US treasuries last year. But here also, it's not obvious that geopolitical factors were mainly the driver of these developments. For instance, China cut its holdings of US treasuries by around $200 billion, but so did Japan. And I mean, there are potentially other important factors at play. I mean, Maurizio already highlighted them, such as the valuation effects, and in case of Japan, for instance, also foreign exchange rate intervention. A last set of evidence that we look at here is basically the evolution in terms of gold purchases. And here we saw quite some interesting developments last year. And if you look at the chart on the left, it's already standing out. And if you would plot this chart all the way back to the 1950s, you would actually find that central banks' purchases of gold has the highest on record since 1950, so a very high level. And then when my staff digged a little bit deeper into the factors that may be behind that, they found actually quite a positive correlation between the degree of geopolitical alignment of countries with Russia and China and gold accumulation. And geopolitical alignment, you can measure that in different ways, but this positive correlation seems to be quite robust across ways to measure it. So basically, on the basis of these findings, I mean, you can kind of conclude so far that we haven't really seen major shifts basically in the international role of currencies in the follow of the war. But at the same time, we also see that it shouldn't be taken for granted, right? We see some cracks, we see some movements. And of course, as these kind of developments are more slow moving, it's something that we need to keep a closer eye on. Moving to the next special feature, which is looking at how an international currency is replaced by another. I mean, this is something that is the forever going question in people working on international monetary systems, and especially also looking into the future. Are we going to have a multipolar currency world? Will another currency take over? And of course, the difficulty we have when we try to answer this question is that there's quite a bit of inertia in the international currency use, right? So it takes a long time for a challenger currency to replace an incumbent, and that's related to network externalities. So for instance, the dollar remains still the leading currency for global trade and finance today. And this is despite the decline in the United States' share in global output and trade. And of course, its network externalities, the deepness, liquidity of the US financial markets play an important role there. Now, of course, if you look in history and to understand how these kind of changes happen, one interesting exception that we can look at is the currency invoicing of trade of countries neighboring the euro area. And this chart illustrates why this is an interesting case and point to look at. So here we look at, on the one hand, the share of the euro as an invoicing currency for exports. So that's the left-handed side chart. And for exports, and on the right-hand side for imports. And what you can see, and this is particularly the case for export, but also for imports, we saw a substantial increase in the use of the euro at the expense of the dollar over the past 2 decades. I mean, it increased by around 20 percentage points. Now, there are two competing hypotheses that may explain these developments. So one is a trade shock. So the stronger trade links of these countries with the euro area may tilt invoicing to the euro area. And there's an exchange rate volatility shock, for instance, where the growing use of the euro as an exchange rate anchor may spill over to invoicing. So the report basically looks into these questions, and the authors of this chapter do so by looking at an econometric model that analyzes jointly the choice of invoicing currency, exchange rate volatility, and trade developments. And they do that for a sample of 13 countries neighboring the euro area between the period 1999 and 2019. And here in this chart, we show basically some evidence what the authors find. And what is the most interesting that comes out of this analysis is that the use of the euro as an invoicing currency increased. So this is the red top in the chart. Simply when countries also increase their trade with euro area. Now, these are the positive blue bars. And this is after controlling for all other factors. And of course, such a factor finding matters for policy because it means that trade integration with the euro area can actually support the international use of the euro. So now turning to the last special feature, and basically here it looks at how the euro compares with the US dollar in international bank lending. So it provides this chapter insights into various potential determinants of currency choices in cross-border bank lending, such as bilateral distance, measures of financial and trade linkages to issuer countries of major currencies, and invoicing currency patterns. So the first interesting finding that comes out of this feature is that actually distance effects matter more for the euro than for the US dollar in cross-border bank loans. And to illustrate this here, we show in the chart on the left the estimates from the regression analysis that's conducted in this chapter, which basically looks at to what extent the distance of the currency issuer to the euro area, to what extent that has an impact basically on this euro-denominated loans versus, in this case, dollar-denominated loans. And what you can see is indeed this negative coefficient that is signed for the euro-denominated claims, which means the further away you are from the euro area, the less likely you're going to see euro-denominated international banking. And for the dollar, as you can see, this is not statistically significant. So basically the distance doesn't really matter. So what this confirms is more or less the euro has a role in cross-border bank lending as a regional currency, whereas the dollar's role is much more global. Another interesting finding from this chapter is also that the currency choice for cross-border bank loans and the choice of currency for trade are complements. So the right-hand side shows this. There's a strong correlation between trade invoicing and bank lending in the euro area. And of course, this chapter in that sense is a nice complement to the previous chapter that already finds that trade invoicing basically has an important role in terms of determining the international use of a currency. Finally, this chapter also looks at basically the linkages and the cross-border bank loan linkages since Brexit, right? And it's interesting because it shows for the euro area, for instance, that the UK still has a disproportionate role, and I mean disproportionate, that is, that can be explained above and beyond what would be there because of proximity. So concretely, what you see in this chart is a network of cross-border loans in euro on the left-hand side in 2021, and on the right-hand side for the US dollars. And the size of the bubbles correspond to the volume of cross-border loans flowing in and out these respective regions. So this important role of the UK, you can see on the left-hand side chart through the size basically of the red bubble, which is the UK. And this probably just reflects the key role of the City of London in global financial system. And it also suggests, actually, if you look on the dollar side, you also see that the UK has quite a big role there, because also there the red bubble is quite big, which shows generally this prominence of the UK as a global financial center. What's interesting for the chart on the right is, as you also can see, that the blue bubble is quite large, and these are offshore centers, and they seem to play an important role, and this may reflect the role of tax optimization. So also the results from this chapter has some important conclusions for policy. They suggest that stronger trade and financial linkages to the euro area foster basically the international use of the euro, and so that preserving open trade and financial markets can be supported for the global use of the euro. And with this, I come to the last slide of our presentation here today, which are the conclusions of the report. So the first main finding is that the international role of the euro has been resilient in 2022. So we have so far not seen substantial changes in the use of international currency since Russia's war in Ukraine. So we have only anecdotal evidence. But this anecdotal evidence, and in particular if you see also the movements into gold, would suggest that the international currency status should not be taken for granted. And actually an important factor that determines the international currency status, and that is a constant throughout every year's report, is really European economic integration. As I mentioned, sound institutions, strong domestic fundamentals are important to promote the international role of the currency. And so in an increasingly fragmented world, this resilience basically of the international role of the euro will be increasingly determined by that and is an important factor. And with this, I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Maurizio and Isabel, for this very useful summary of key findings from the ECB report. I now hand over to Linda for Linda's comments.
Thank you for having me discuss this report. First thing is that all of my comments are my own and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York or Federal Reserve System. I think as I read the report, despite developments in the macroeconomic environment and Russia's war in Ukraine, the report shows that the international roles of the euro have been resilient in 2022. The special features section address high-profile questions. These are geopolitical fragmentation risks, where the evidence to date is more about announcements without broader diversification trends really showing up in the data. Some developments around gold accumulation are cited. The report shows that European economic integration supports euro use, especially in trade invoicing, but also in cross-border lending. And as Isabel said at the very end, do not take the international currency status for granted, and that's for the dollar as well as for the euro. In terms of my discussion, I will reiterate some broad trends. I want to emphasize that the international roles of currencies are diverse. And as Maurizio emphasized too, the dollar here and the euro are together the majority of currencies playing these roles, where the dollar is the kind of primary and the euro a strong second currency in the functionality. I'll then turn to some comments on the special features. I'll provide a bit of additional content on the composition of official foreign reserve portfolios and on gold holdings. My emphasis will be a little bit on the specific macroeconomic and financial considerations, particularly thinking about investment tranches in reserve manager portfolios. I'll come back to the issue of geopolitical fragmentation. I'll raise a measurement issue in some of the data, and basically underscore the synergies and roles between currency roles and international trade and finance. But overall, I'm going to be giving, again, compliments on an excellent report. So broad trends. So dollar and then the euro with resilient status across the different international roles. So this is for all the key roles that are specifically in the international monetary system that refers to composition of official foreign exchange reserves. There's not evidence on the exchange rate regime anchors, but that's pretty consistent. The safe haven sovereign asset holdings, particularly important for US dollars, Swiss franc, and yen. Not so much emphasized, but those are still consistent. And also shares of domestic bank notes held by foreigners. In terms of the report and in terms of a lot of the popular discussion, the main area that receives considerable focus is on the composition of official foreign exchange reserves, where the dollar share has trend declines. I'll come back to that in a second. In terms of transaction currencies, unit and account currencies, this remains very strong. Most bilateral foreign exchange transactions, most invoicing of international trade, regardless of the counterparties, Most new international debt issuance, cross-border lending, and wire transfers all use dollars and euros strongly. Both are also strong as infrastructure currencies and in bank international services. That includes SWIFT, which of course has gotten a lot of attention in the past almost year and a half, and also in clearing and settling domestic and international payments. And I want to emphasize that each of these different roles, whether it's the international monetary system, the units of accounts, the infrastructure currency, they all have different types of drivers. In the report, some of the key drivers are shown to be different across the euros and the dollars. So the dollar, as some of the evidence in the special topics shows, the dollar continues to show up as more of a global currency, the euro as more of a regional currency. This is a pattern that I think has been observed in this particular report since its inception. From the early 2000s, there was a strong role of euro area proximity to the use of euros in different types of functions. So there you would have, if you're in the euro area proximity, you'd have a higher share of euros and official foreign exchange reserves, more likely peg or at least manage your currency against the euro, higher shares of euro banknotes held. There are also trade synergies with euro area countries. Relative pricing of some traded goods pushes you more towards euros, more euro cross-border lending, and also from a personnel and labor linkage, increased wire transfers, for example, for workers, and remittances as they go and locate in different countries and send funds back to their country of origin. And in fact, the special feature boxes B and C look at trade invoicing and cross-border loans. And here you see that countries in the periphery to the euro area are increasingly using euros on invoicing their exports. There's a flatter path for currency of imports where that is more kind of globally targeted and uses more dollars. So an implication is more trade integration with the euro area means more euro use. And this is all reinforced by the other evidence that's provided, that is that the choice of euros for cross-border lending is much more sensitive to geographic distance compared to dollars. So I think these are kind of all consistent with this regional currency expansion. My main critical comment would just be that in a future report to further pull together the topics of these two special feature boxes and further explore these synergies between trade and finance choices. So let me go on to some of the evidence and the critique a little bit, not critique really, but just commentary. On official reserve holdings, this gets a lot of attention in the discussion of a declining dollar role. When that attention is given, the kind of commentary is about the dollar share, for example, in official portfolios going from 66% here in 2015 down to about 60% by the end of 22. And you see this slow moving decline in the share represented by these dark blue colors. The euro share is pretty steady over time. That's the light blue part. So it's the somewhat larger role of other currencies in the portfolios. The academic research into portfolio allocations, and a lot of this is by Barry Eichengreen and co-authors at the ECB, authors at the ECB, stress macroeconomic stability, store value metrics, the denomination of foreign currency debt of a country, the international trade exposures of partners of countries and the volatility hedges. There's also more recently positing that, especially when we've gotten into low interest rate periods, central banks will diversify their portfolios and take on less liquid currencies in order to get higher portfolio returns. And as the special topic box emphasizes, that there's potentially a role here for geopolitics. I think it's a really interesting finding from the ECB report that there is strong evidence of rebalancing of portfolios by official reserve managers. That is, that reserve managers have a target allocation of shares. So, for example, if the dollar assets appreciate, then they get overweight in the portfolio. And so you would reduce those holdings of assets and rebalance to, for example, have a higher share of euros. So that points to portfolio management and not changing currency roles. And that's a really interesting result. In my own research, I've been looking at some of this portfolio allocation, and I posit that the foreign exchange reserve managers might have liquidity tranches, which is the part that they hold, for example, to cover their debt or their liquidity needs, but also this larger part, these investment tranches, which where they might be more willing to diversify that investment tranche to a greater degree. And I also posit that the geopolitical alignment of countries could manifest either in the shares of key currencies in portfolios or in the size of official sector holdings. There are alternative measures of geopolitical alignment with the US. I'll just show you, for example, one based on UN voting patterns. And I think if you look at that, the blue are advanced economy dots, the reds are non-advanced economies. Just click through here. What you have on the bottom axis is the degree to which a country tends to agree in its voting with the United States at the United Nations, and that's the most recent period from 2017 to 2020, and then an earlier period from 1999 through 2016. And you see that there's consistency in the blocks of disagreement with the US, consistency more or less in the blocks of agreement in voting with the US, and then there's a middle group. And then there, in thinking about investment tranche, the ways that that tends to be done is either looking at import bills or short-term foreign debt holdings. And so I've looked at annual data for 80 countries, building on some work by Aslanalp, Eichengreen, and Simpson. And basically, by far, the standard drivers in the portfolio allocations of reserves continue to be the currency regime and bilateral trade patterns across countries. And this is consistent with the ECB findings. Now, it is the case that there's a role for investment tranche. US shares and portfolios are lower. US dollar shares and roles of non-traditional currencies are higher when the investment tranche share of the portfolio is larger. There's not a lot of difference when you look at the zero lower bound or low interest rate periods. And actually, it's interesting, a lack of geopolitical alignment with, for example, the US does not necessarily mean lower US dollar shares in portfolios, all else equal. Once you control for bilateral trade and debt patterns, these countries are more likely to have a higher, not lower dollar share in official reserve portfolios. So that is a little bit of caution about looking at some of the raw data without controlling for trade and debt patterns of those countries. Just going on to gold holdings, the work by this Aslanalp, Eichengreen and Simpson-Bell is very interesting. It shows that at least through the end of 2021, the rise in gold held by the official sector in emerging and developing economies is mainly a phenomena that's associated with Russia, China, India, and Turkey. So it's very concentrated. Otherwise, there's very strong inertia. And if you look at this rightmost chart from their paper on gold, this is showing you the share of gold in official reserve assets over time. And you could see that the emerging and developing economies, which are the line in green, are where there's been a bit of an uptick in recent years. But it really also shows you that the value of gold holdings overall remains a small fraction of the value of financial assets in official reserve holdings. So concentrated, but still small relative to reserves, which also have increased. Now, just a point on the data, and this is a question for the ECB authors. There's a recent divergence between official data and industry estimates. So how much have official gold holdings really increased? Here you have in green the numbers that are reported to the International Monetary Fund. And here in red, well, let's go with blue. In blue is the aggregate that is used in the ECB report, which is by the World Gold Council. So the official gold holding estimates, according to official data through the IMF and this World Gold Council estimate, which is a private compilation, depart very much in the last 1 to 2 years or 1.5 years. And that is for holdings that I think are not central bank holdings, but are other official pieces of a portfolio that are estimated. So what do we take of that being the really the piece of evidence on which that gold accumulation is really concentrated? So how do you interpret that? What does that piece mean? That could be sovereign wealth funds. It could be some other component. So to conclude, the ECB's international roles of the Euro report has been the most comprehensive accounting of international roles of currencies since its inception, and I continue to applaud this team for putting this report together. It demonstrates the importance of careful monitoring and use of data to inform risks and the validity of different claims. And just congratulations to the whole ECB team on this report for another contribution to frontier analytics and their rich statistical collections. I think there are still some open questions, and I think their closing reminders about the importance of being vigilant and not taking these roles for granted is something for all of us. So I'll stop sharing here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda, for these important points, including findings from your own research. I now pass on to Daniel, who will offer a political science perspective and notably some key insights derived from your new book. Over to you, Daniel.
Thanks to SUERF for the opportunity to speak today on a really interesting, important topic on such an esteemed panel. My remarks today, as Ernest said, are going to be largely linked to my new book, Bucking the Buck, U.S. Financial Sanctions and the International Backlash Against the Dollar. So I want to just open with my bottom line up front here, which is that as the United States has increased its reliance on financial sanctions as a tool of foreign policy, what it's doing is provoking anti-dollar policy responses from America's adversaries. And though I don't believe, and I would agree with the other presenters, that these responses are not likely to upend the dollar's position as the world's top international currency, I do think what could happen over time is we would see a diminishment of the coercive capabilities that the United States derives from dollar centrality. So I'll provide a bit more background on that now, including the rising use of sanctions before we look at some examples. So it's kind of a cliche that Americans are proud of the fact that our country has never been ruled by a monarch. And yet, perhaps ironically, the US dollar has now become a powerful symbol of American financial royalty. The dollar is often described as the king of all currencies, for instance. And I think that's an appropriate term because we know across the full spectrum of international roles that a national currency can play, the reserve currency role, cross-border payments, trade settlement, turnover in foreign exchange markets, and so on, that the dollar really outcompetes all comers and really lacks a true rival in this space, right? The euro playing sort of a clear second international currency, regional currency roles has been discussed today. Dollar preeminence means that the US banking system is at the center of the global economy, and this means that the US government has legal control over the financial plumbing that the world economy depends on to function. And this is important because it has consequences for American coercive power. So with little more than the stroke of the president's pen through issuing an executive order or through an act of Congress, the US government can use financial sanctions to really impose significant economic costs on foreign targets. That could be individuals, firms, or state institutions by freezing their dollar assets or cutting them off from access to the banks through which those dollars flow. And the consequences for individual targets, referred to as specially designated nationals or SDNs, are severe. Significantly impairs a target's capacity to participate in international trade, investment, debt repayment, and deprives them of access to their wealth. I want to offer just a sort of a real quick summary of the background on the growing use of financial sanctions, which kind of really emerged as a popular new tool of economic statecraft around the turn of the century. Been used before that in previous cases, but that's really the point at which their popularity starts to take off. And this is because of a couple factors. One, disillusionment with traditional economic sanctions, things like trade embargoes, which cause a lot of collateral damage, right? They harm innocent people within the targeted economy and often don't hurt the decision makers themselves. Another reason was around the turn of the century, especially after 9/11, there's this need in the United States to have tools that can hurt non-state actors. You can't impose a trade embargo on Al-Qaeda, for instance. And so financial sanctions are what were called smart sanctions at the time. They can be targeted at individuals or scaled up in very big ways, as we've seen against Russia. So they offer a lot of flexibility and they solve some of the problems of the old way of using economic statecraft. The primary way that the United States initiates a new round of sanctions is through a presidential executive order, which directs the US Treasury, specifically the Office of Foreign Assets Controller, OFAC, to add additional SDN, specially designated nationals, to its blacklist, which effectively tells US banks and all banks operating in the United States that they cannot do business with those people or entities. Over the last 20 years, again, going back to the year 2000, the United States has been using this tool with increasing frequency. There's different ways to measure this. I'll just give you a couple. In the year 2000, there were 22 executive orders that were linked to sanctions programs on the books. All right. By 2020, this had increased from 22 up to 94. That's an increase of nearly 500%. And that doesn't include the actual list of SDNs, which is now over 10,000 long. We can also talk about country targets. I think is a more meaningful point for our conversation. In the year 2000, there were just 4 foreign governments that were targeted directly under a U.S. Treasury country program. Today, that number is greater than 20. So roughly 1 out of every 10 sovereign states is at least targeted under a U.S. sanctions program. They vary in terms of scale, right? The Russia program is much larger than other programs, which are much narrower in scope. But the point is, right, many countries are now touched by this in one way or the other. And if we include penalties from secondary sanctions, then the list gets even longer. So the more the United States has reached for financial sanctions, the more it is introducing political risk into the international currency system. That is, it's making adversaries in foreign capitals and sometimes friends and allies. We can talk about the Trump administration's decision to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal. It's making these other countries more aware of their strategic vulnerabilities that flow from dependence on the dollar. Some governments have responded by implementing what I call anti-dollar policies, measures that are designed to reduce an economy's reliance on the US currency for investment in cross-border transactions. Now, as Linda mentioned earlier, right, often these are words and they don't really go farther than that. I completely agree. Many of these measures fail and fail spectacularly. We could talk about Venezuela's oil-backed cryptocurrency, the Petro, which was a complete failure. But some anti-dollar policy efforts have produced modest levels of de-dollarization in certain parts of the world economy. I'm just going to really quickly hit on some top-line findings from the book. And I want to be clear, this focuses on the period 2008 through 2020. The book was largely finished before the war started. And so really, this is all about things that sort of happened leading up to that. So countries that were sanctioned by the U.S., analysis in the book finds, they bought more monetary gold. We've talked about that a lot, and we can perhaps discuss more why that's a useful hedge. But on an annual basis, we're more likely to increase their monetary gold holdings than unsanctioned states. I have an entire chapter in the book that looks at gold's reemergence as an investment for central banks starting around 2010. Countries sanctioned by the United States, there's also some evidence, were more likely to somewhat reduce their U.S. Treasury holdings. They were more likely to sign local currency swap agreements between central banks that could potentially pave the way to settle more trade in non-dollar currencies. And countries sanctioned by the U.S. were also likely to settle less trade in the U.S. dollar. So the point here is, like, the broad patterns in the data suggest that U.S. sanctions specifically do correlate with anti-dollar policies and de-dollarizations. Again, I want to be clear, this is at the margins. This is not revolutionary. This is not me predicting the end of dollar dominance, but that we will see sort of these pockets of the world where these things are happening in smaller areas. And I want to talk more about two specific cases that I think are probably on everyone's mind. So briefly, let's talk about Russia and China. So, and that came up, I think, in Isabel's presentation as well. So let's talk about Russia before the war first. And this is important. Russia's history with sanctions did not begin in 2022. Russia has been under some level, an increasing level of U.S. financial sanctions pressure dating back to 2014, when, of course, Russia illegally annexes Crimea. In 2014, you see an immediate response, both in terms of anti-dollar rhetoric and an immediate shift in increasing the pace of its gold purchases at the Central Bank of Russia. There's additional sanctions rounds in 2015, 16, and 17. The big one comes in 2018. This is really critical, and the book sort of highlights this. This is during the Trump administration. This tranche of sanctions hits at 7 Russian oligarchs, including Oleg Deripaska, 17 Russian government officials, 12 firms in key export industries. The U.S. is kind of moving beyond defense into things like nickel, into aluminum, into energy sanctions. And this provokes a really severe Russian response. And so the Central Bank of Russia, in 1 year, in 2018, cuts its dollar holdings from 45% down to 20%. That's really an unprecedented kind of diversification. That's not portfolio management, right? That is de-dollarization. And it's preemptive, right? Sort of getting ahead of what happens in 2022, which is the freezing of Russian FX assets. And Russia sort of moves that difference into RMB and into euros. We also see the really first strong signs of Russo-Chinese cooperation. Russia starts to pay for more of its Chinese imports using China's currency. We also see China begin to pay for more of Russian exports in euros. This is a really interesting pattern. If you go back to 2014, 90% of Russian exports to China were paid for in dollars. By 2020, 80% of Russian exports to China were now paid for in euros. That's a really dramatic shift. And most of that, again, happens in 2018. Prior to the war, Russia is also de-dollarizing trade settlement with India and with the Eurozone. Those moves were also clearly a reaction to U.S. sanctions, and the book talks about that too. Since the invasion, what have we seen? Well, again, Isabel talked about some of this, so I'll be quick. Russia has been further forced out of the dollar system. Putin often says, we're not ditching the dollar, it's ditching us, and that's true, right? And so what we've seen is that there's been a greater dependence in Russia on China's currency. Around 20% of total Russian trade now, right? So not just with China, total Russian trade, exports and imports is settled in RMB based on CBR's data. Savings in yuan account for 11% of Russia's total deposits. That's up from 0 before the war. The RMB is now the most widely traded currency in Russia, and an increasing number of examples exist that suggest Russia is using the RMB in cross-border payments with third countries. And that's notable, right? Countries like Bangladesh and Japan, there have been reports about RMB payments being made between Russia and those countries. There's two ways to look at this, I would say. One, you could say sanctions are working because they're pushing Russia out of the US dollar, out of the euro. And that's true. But there's a yes, but, right? Yes, but Russia is working with partners like China to develop workarounds. alternatives are available. They're less efficient alternatives. You would not use them if you had access to the dollar system, no doubt. But sanctions contribute to creating scale in these areas. And the more that the United States uses sanctions and pushes countries into these, right, these other networks, the more efficient they may become over time. Okay, so what about China? Maybe the most important case. First thing I would say is it's important to recognize that China's interest in RMB internationalization dates back to at least the global financial crisis. I started studying it back in 2010. It wasn't politicized at the time. It was more about economic vulnerabilities and why China sort of saw some, at least elements of the Chinese state, saw some benefits to internationalizing the currency. But recently, geopolitical concerns have really become the dominant force behind these internationalization efforts. I'm going to hit briefly some key moments. 2014 is critical. U.S. sanctions against Russia do raise eyebrows in Beijing. It demonstrates that the United States is willing to use the dollar as a weapon against great powers. Prior to Russia, 2014, Iran's the biggest economy that had been targeted. And we all know that U.S.-Iranian relations have been fraught, going back to 79. So, in Beijing, it's sort of, well, what about us? Maybe the United States would use this tool against us, perhaps. 2018 is a critical moment. The U.S. decision, Trump administration's decision to unilaterally withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. That angers China, who has economic interests in Iran because of the secondary sanctions that affects their ties. China also recognizes that Europe is angry, right? I'm sure you're all familiar with this. In Europe, the sort of anti-dollar rhetoric that emerges after that decision. Financial elites in China say, hey, this is a moment of opportunity for the RMB because maybe with people affected with the dollar, they'll look more to our currency. The critical year, in my view, though, is 2020. And that's because in response to Beijing's crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong, the United States chooses to use financial sanctions by targeting Carrie Lam and 10 other CCC officials, with financial sanctions. And this is, I think, just really a sea change moment. It confirms in China that the United States is willing to use the tool against them. Yes, it's Hong Kong, but we all know Hong Kong is really, right, China now. And so internationalizing the RMB becomes a strategic imperative, I think, after this moment. Just a couple quotes to sort of illustrate this point. There are many more that the book covers. Former PBOC Chair Zhao notes in public remarks that RMB internationalization is the only way that China could, quote, effectively resist U.S. sanctions. Another Chinese banker and former PBOC economist at a public event discusses this, notes, renminbi internationalization, and I'm quoting here, was a good to have. It is now becoming a must have. Right? There are all kinds of quotes like this. Again, talk is cheap. I want to be clear. The point is there is a change in the way elites in China are thinking about RMB internationalization. Critical point I would end with here is that the goal, in my view, is not to topple the dollar. Okay, I don't believe that is actually what the Chinese state is interested in. Rather, RMB internationalization is viewed as a means to enhancing Chinese autonomy and resilience in the face of U.S. economic power. So briefly, I'll wrap up with some thoughts on how China is doing. We can talk about SIPS, China's cross-border interbank payment system. It's a correspondent banking network with Chinese banks at the core, with around 1,300 foreign banks as indirect participants. Launched in 2015, it's steadily growing, adding between 100 to 200 foreign bank participants per year. The system is designed to facilitate cross-border payments via Chinese banks, not American banks, in RMB rather than in dollars. SIPS remains very small, I want to be clear, very small when compared to the cross-border dollar clearing system. And it still depends on SWIFT for a lot of its messaging. But the use of SIPS is growing steadily. Daily transactions on the network tripled between the first quarter of 2020 and the fourth quarter of 2022. Daily volume of RMB cleared on the system more than doubled during that span. So it's growing fast. And I think there's some evidence that its use increased a bit faster after the Russia sanctions in 22. Zooming out a bit further, around 23% of China's cross-border trade is now settled in its own currency. That's up from around 10% in 2017. This trend, I think, will continue in the coming years as China does work to purchase more oil from Gulf states in RMB and deepens RMB payments cooperation with Russia and with other countries. The bottom line here is China wants to have its own cross-border financial plumbing in place, and it wants it to be in good working order as soon as possible to prepare for a day when the U.S. might respond to a security crisis with Russia-style sanctions program. Doesn't mean I think China is going to be done with the dollar. I don't think any country can completely get away from that. But right, it wants the infrastructure in place as essentially a hedge. What do I think about the reserve currency role briefly? I think we'll see RMB reserves grow steadily, but very slowly in the coming years. I do not believe China's political leadership has any interest or intention of pushing the RMB to replace the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Maybe we can talk more about that later. I'll wrap up with a final thought. I don't think these geopolitically motivated moves by Russia, China, or any other country bravely threaten dollar supremacy. The dollar remains the world's indispensable currency. It maintains economic and political advantages over all alternatives, but the growing number of states espousing anti-dollar viewpoints and adopting anti-dollar policies does threaten to chip away at dollar dominance in pockets of the world economy on the margins and weaken the future potency of U.S. financial sanctions. I've got some thoughts on suggestions for U.S. sanctions policy. I'll table those so we can get to Q&A, and I look forward to continuing our conversation.
Thank you very much, Daniel. We have a little bit more than 20 minutes left. I would like to start out with Robert Macaulay, who has on past occasions frequently commented on this report. Bob, over to you.
Thank you, Ernest, for the floor. And if I may just ask a question about the report and make a comment on Daniel's presentation. On the report, in the examination of the determinants of currency of loans, international loans, I wonder if the anchor currency is being proxied for by distance. That would make sense because most of the countries whose currencies are anchored to the euro are close to the euro area, whereas the dollar anchored currencies are spread all around the world. And indeed, there is in the data, seems to me, a very strong relationship between the anchor currency and not only the denomination of loans, but also the denomination of bonds and also the denomination of foreign exchange reserves, which all makes sense because those are all variations on the same optimizing problem of how do you get the optimum means variance in your portfolio. And if your currency is anchored to the euro, then it will be the low variance currency, and you have a natural tendency to invest in the currency that is the major currency that is closest to your own currency in terms of its co-movement in the foreign exchange market. A comment on Daniel. Daniel, your book is available in Europe. It was delivered to me in Portugal from Germany just days ago. And I couldn't help but notice on page 6 a great line: dollar dependence remains reality even for sanctioned regimes. And I would underscore that by pointing out several things about Russia on the eve of the invasion. Best I can tell, as late as 2020, 38% of Russian reserves are still dollar exposure, either actually held in dollars, mostly outside the United States, or swapped so that they're effectively dollars. 20% of the banking system is in dollars, and the dollar dominates in the foreign exchange trading. So this is a country that's been under sanctions for more than 5 years, and it still somehow can't get rid of the dollar. And I think that should inform our thinking about what sort of abuse of sanctions is required on the US side to do real damage to the international role of the dollar. And just a final thought on that, seems like there's a kind of a short-termism problem here, that policymakers in any given administration in the US view sanctions as sort of a cheap option, and the long-term undermining of their efficacy is sort of the next administration's problem. Thank you again, Ernest.
Thank you very much, Bob. I would like to read out to you some further questions that were posed in the chat. There were 2 questions from Gergo Hudets from the ESM. First one is, how can the international monetary and financial system reap the benefits of currency diversification on financial markets without increasing the risk of fragmentation? What policies can help the former, so the diversification, while reducing the risk of fragmentation? And he also had a methodological question. When looking at the invoicing currency share, do you include or exclude intra-euro area trade in the statistics of the ECB report? Then we had a question from, I think, Nikolai Gerchev from the European Commission, which is, past data suggests that the share of the euro in asset holdings has been stable around 20%. At the same time, the share in cross-border transactions, invoicing, forex settlements, has been closer to 40%, falling to around 30% by end 2022, and even more since the beginning of 23. What have been the reasons operating until recently behind the higher share of use of the euro in current transactions? What are the latest factors that would explain what seems to be the fading away of these reasons? Then I have a question from Dr. Felix Schmidt from KfW Bankengruppe from Germany. What do you think about a potentially higher volume of EU bonds in the future? Would this be a big push for the euro's international role, creating a deeper and more liquid euro treasury market? And then a question from Rafał Raciborski from the European Commission to Linda. What are the pros and cons of increasing the international role of a currency from your US experience? Are there downsides to the leading role of the dollar? So I would start out with Maurizio and with Isabel.
First of all, let me thank everybody for their presentations and discussions, and thanks a lot for SUERF for organizing this. I mean, it's great to have a discussion on these topics and to get some ideas for what to do for future editions is always great. And thanks to Linda for already making some suggestions. And we definitely have, things on our work agenda to look into more carefully. On some of the questions, I mean, on these first questions on what drives a bit, if you look back in the data, the developments in the international use of the euro, I think, where we did see some sort of a change basically was around the sovereign debt crisis, right? And I mean, there we saw a decline in the international use of the euro. And of course, that has steadily gone up, but it's not to the levels that we saw before that, right? And I think it ties a bit to maybe the last question then on, what are the factors driving that? And of course, a more profound, deeper integration of the EMU would be an important factor there, right? So, I mean, every time we talk about what drives the international role of a currency, we have to look at home rather than more abroad about what drives the international role of one's own currency. So for the euro, I mean, anything that basically would lead to deeper, more integrated financial markets is, of course, an important factor. And then, for instance, there has been a discussion on the role of the next generation EU, for instance, as well, because that's, of course, already an EU, basically, first step towards an EU safe asset, let's say. And of course, having more of this would of course be one factor that would benefit that. So definitely that would be an important factor that we would see going forward. In terms of the question whether intra-trade is included, no, that's excluded, right? So we're only looking at extra trade. In terms of this question on the one hand having more diversification, but at the same time reducing risk of fragmentation, I think the main factor, at least, I mean, maybe Maurizio has also ideas, but I would say also the liquidity of financial markets, right? I mean, any risk that you have from fragmentation, if you can hedge against them, basically, I mean, you may have diverse currencies, but especially if you're exposed to a currency, but you can hedge against risks, I think that's always an important factor that can help there. In one maybe last side remark from my side, I mean, there was some discussion, I think I liked a lot Daniel's perspective. I mean, we look at the same questions, but from different kind of angles, and I think the conclusions are very similar. And I guess at the extreme is what you're saying is, you need to be careful not to kill the chicken with the golden egg in a way, right? So, and I think we all agree with that, and that's partly also where we say international role of a currency shouldn't be taken for granted, right? You have it today, and it has an exorbitant privilege and exorbitant duty, right? That comes along with it. But and I'm sure Linda has more to say on that from the dollar's perspective. But at the same time, of course, we need to make sure that our policies that we put in place remain sound and focus on this predictability, stability, and safety of the currency. Of course, otherwise you put that at risk. I pass to Maurizio. I'm sure I have much more original ideas than mine.
No. Thank you. Thank you also for the discussions and really enlightening. I mean, it would be good to have these discussions before we prepare the next year report, but we already take inspiration for all the comments. So let me also answer to some of the remarks in the presentation by Linda and Daniel. But let's start first with our guests in the chat. The question about the benefits of currency diversification and fragmentation is super interesting. We always reflect on that. It's not easy to answer. One of the benefits of diversification is that you may have more discipline. You may insert more discipline. At the same time, you, as mentioned by Isabel, you lose economies of scale and liquidity that you may help. You may try to foster through harmonization. Derivative instruments to hedge currency risk and other tools, but there is really a clear trade-off, and it's not easy to provide a positive normative answer in terms of policies to adopt in order to achieve that. And this actually brings one of the comments to the discussion by Daniel. I think what is missing is that what is emerging clearly from the literature on the dominant currency paradigm by Gita Gopinath is that these complementarities are really crucial, because eventually you want to have your currency to be used as a payment currency, which is something that we see that you may try to disentangle from detach from the dollar dominance, but then you want to have it also as an investment currency. You want to deposit. You want to use it also in order to borrow. And you see that how it's difficult eventually to detach from these complementarities in terms of dominance of major currencies like the dollar and the euro. And I would like to mention something that it is not in the report, but you may have seen. There is a lot of attention in what China is doing, and Russia is doing, and investors are doing, and we see there are not, in some elements, there are no major changes, but there is one element which is quite striking, is that the renminbi role as an investment currency in official foreign exchange reserves remains stable. There we had a clear positive trend in the past years, and probably because of the crisis, this trend stopped in 2022, because probably of geopolitical reasons. So there is a survey of the HSBC where they show clearly in one chart how official managers, they reduced over time, over the past years, their benchmark. So they have an outlook for the benchmark of the renminbi, which was expected to increase, given this has also increased the renminbi bonds that have been increased in benchmark indices in the bond market. But over time, the outlook of this benchmark, they say, okay, in 2030, we would like to have 15%, then 13%, now 10%. So that is something that tells you that how difficult it is always to disentangle these complementarities across different views. Then many thanks, of course, to Linda Wall, the suggestions. Indeed, investment versus liquidity is crucial. Usually what we do is that we try to guess this indirectly from the data, because we don't have information about these two different, but we could guess. We have some information about how much cash is held on total. This is in general, this is something that for some countries from the BOP payment, from the balance of payments, but this is the only information that we have a little bit. How is the size of cash versus other securities assets, and but crucially, of course, the drivers are different, and then we can observe that, we can study that, we can think how to study that in an indirect way in our studies. So that is gold, again, that we knew, of course, we know this come actually from a presentation SUERF a couple of months ago. It comes from, it's a question to be returned to our colleague at the World Gold Council, and what they actually show. They say that this comes from bilateral contacts. They say, but what is the point that they want to make, and I think is a fair point, is that at least using the same, if they are consistent using these sources, there is a large spike in 2022. So we have to rely on them. And then finally, I think there was a question, of course, on the volume of EU bonds, and then is, of course, I mean, the lack of a benchmark in the euro area. It's a major obstacle to the international role of the euro. We know that, and this is why we keep on repeating that advanced capital market union and banking union, they are the basis in order to create this benchmark for the euro area, may really support the international role of the euro. So far, we have EU bonds. We know that they have a natural There could be another conclusion with these EU bonds to foster a particular program, the next generation EU programs. It has to be seen. It has to be seen if there is the political will to advance this capital and market union and banking union, which way naturally they will support also the creation of a benchmark in the euro area, which is really crucial in order to price and to have a risk-free common benchmark for all euro area countries. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. Before I hand over to Linda, I put in another question which came up in the chat and which might be interesting to hear a view on, which is from Colin Weiss. And the question is, many of the countries with central banks that made large purchases of gold last year also had investors, likely including central banks, making large purchases of US securities. Dollar amounts of these purchases are typically much larger than the value of the gold purchases. Linda, over to you.
Yeah, so I want to maybe try to answer a couple of the questions through a little bit of an overarching framework, which is, you know, the conversation about the dominant dollar is one that's about a unipolar world in terms of currencies, but you know, we already have a multipolar world where we have the euro used a lot, not as much as the dollar, but used a lot, and then drops off a lot to other currencies. What happens if there are other currencies that play larger roles? Well, it depends on how you get there. So if you're getting larger roles of a currency by increasing the depth and liquidity of their financial markets, by improving institutions, by having better kind of plumbing arrangements across border, better risk sharing opportunities, you could have a more stable international system. You could have improved financial conditions, improved diversification. You know, there's lots of possibilities in that kind of multipolarity. If you get to that multipolarity through increasing frictions and costs and developing kind of non-cooperative or less cooperative blocks, then you get very different global outcomes and very different welfare consequences. So I think how you get to the endpoint and the reasons for the endpoint are actually very important. And I do also want to point everyone to work at the IMF and other institutions on geoeconomic fragmentation and block formation. And there's a lot of scenario analysis that's going on to think about if you form blocks across countries for different reasons, who's in them, then you get different configurations of inefficiencies in trade and production or efficiencies, distortions. You might lose risk diversification. You might lose access to liquid and safe assets. You might have less knowledge diffusion across borders. So there's a whole lot of consequences that I think are really important for the global community to sift through. Possibly more important than a question like, are reserves diversified and, you know, changing to one small degree or another, but what kind of is the general structure that we're going towards? In terms of the question about downsides from having a large international currency role, you know, of course, you have to manage, it's an upside and downside, you have to manage your currency and your institutions very responsibly. So that you know, bring your users in the world more towards a stable environment. You have lower funding costs likely from having your currency used as a safe haven type of assets. Of course, that changes. You know, it's a benefit and a cost at the same time. It changes your spending priorities and investment trade-offs. And you have a different pattern of insulation and responsiveness vis-a-vis domestic and foreign shocks, and also a different pattern of monetary policy effectiveness. So there are trade-offs from that.
Thank you very much, Linda. The last 2 minutes go to Daniel.
It's been a great discussion so far. I know we're at the end of our time, and I don't want to push things over. So I'll just say it's been a really great conversation. I think the answers and responses so far have been really helpful.
This then concludes our SUERF-Baffi Bocconi e-lecture on the international role of the euro, geopolitical tensions, inflation, and rising yields. What impact on international currencies? I think the number of participants and also the quality and the number of questions that were raised testify to the topicality of the issue and to the high interests among the expert and community and the public at large. Let me give a big thank you to Isabel, to Maurizio, to Linda, to Daniel for your excellent presentations and for being prepared to provide answers to the many questions. Let me give a big thank you to Bob, Gergo, Nikolai, Felix, and Rafael for your important and relevant questions, and to all of you for participating in this event and for your interest. Bye-bye and take care.
Bye.
Thanks, Ernest. Nice to meet you, Linda.
Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, same here.
Bye-bye, Linda. Thank you.